Towards the end of August 1996, residents of Sunmen, a small village of 60 households, gathered to watch the gruesome sight of an autopsy, about to be performed publicly on the road running through the village. With morbid curiosity, the crowd witnessed the victim, Wang Xiuping, a local woman, undergo a craniotomy to ascertain the cause of her death. Just days before the woman died after a long-running feud between two families turned into a physical confrontation. In the crowd of ghoulish onlookers were the woman's two children, her 16-year-old daughter, and 13-year-old son Zhang Kou Kou. The young boy had lost his mother, and was now watching her skull being removed in full view of the village. It was a sight burned forever in the mind of the young boy. 23 years later, on January 8, 2019, that young boy appeared in court, charged with the intentional homicide of 3 people. The man who caused his mother's death, and 2 other members of the same family. He claimed that he ended the lives of the 3 men to take revenge for the death of his mother. In 2018, the residents of the village once known as Sunmen, but now called Wangping, 26 kilometers from the city of Hanzhong in Shanxi province, were celebrating the Spring Festival with their families. The 15th of February 2018 fell on the day during the Spring Festival, where tradition dictated that families visit burial sites or tombs of their relatives who'd passed and pay their respects. Mourners would burn incense and fake paper money, and leave offerings to the dead. A few months earlier, Zhang Kou Kou had returned to his family home for the first time since going abroad for work. His father, Zhang Furu, and older sister Zhang Libo were delighted and surprised to see him return. After her death in 1996, the mother of Zhang Kou Kou had been buried in the mountains outside the village, and the family were going to pay their respects. Zhang Furu asked his son if he would like to come with them, but the offer was declined. This wasn't unusual. Zhang Kou Kou had only visited the grave once since his mother's death, so nothing was thought of it. Unbeknownst to the rest of the family, there was a particular reason he didn't want to go. He was planning to honor his mother in a different way. Once his family were out of the door, he waited in his bedroom looking out of a window towards the home of his neighbors, the Wang family, the people responsible for the death of his mother. On seeing around 15 members of the neighboring family leave, he grabbed a knife, Molotov cocktail, put on a hat and face mask, and left his home. He knew they would be heading to their family's burial site, and while the Wang family slowly made their way along the village road to the graves, Zhang Kou Kou got ahead of them, heading to the site through the surrounding countryside. He hid behind a wall, while the Wang family made offerings to their ancestors. Biding his time, he waited patiently for the family to finish and start to walk back home. As they went to leave, he emerged from his hiding place and locked his eyes on Wang Zhengjun, the man who caused his mother's death years earlier. Seeing that Wang Zhengjun had fallen a little behind the rest of the family, Zhang Kou Kou took his opportunity to strike. Sneaking up from behind, he put his knife to the throat of his target and sliced it open. Falling to the floor, Wang Zhengjun received several more wounds to the abdomen. The rest of the family walking ahead hadn't seen the brutal attack. Zhang Kou Kou was on a mission and quickly got to his next target. He went after Wang Xiaojun, the older brother of Wang Zhengjun. He used the knife to pierce his target's stomach several times. Wang Xiaojun fell to the floor and rolled into a roadside drainage ditch, his attacker following him down, continuing the frenzied assault. This attack was witnessed by other family members and villagers. People started screaming for the police and ambulances to be called, but Zhang Kou Kou ran from the scene before anyone was brave enough to try and stop him as he headed to the Wang family home. Walking into the home's courtyard, he saw the 2 brothers' 71-year-old father, Wang Zixin. He attacked the old man with a knife to the stomach. The old farmer was made of stern stuff and fought back, trying to get control of the knife, losing a finger in the process. It was no good. Zhang Kou Kou was too strong, too determined, and ended the old man's life. Covered in the blood of his 3 victims, his weapon in hand, he walked back onto the village road, in front of the onlookers who were too stunned to try and stop him. He went to a car belonging to Wang Xiaojun, smashed a window, lit the Molotov cocktail, and threw it into the vehicle. As the rear of the car burned, he turned to the shocked villagers and told them that he had finally avenged his mother. By now, the gathered witnesses recognized who the crazed man was. Some villagers and Wang family members had found items to arm themselves and tried to approach him, while old childhood friends tried to talk him down. Zhang Kou Kou waved his weapon at them, shouting that he'd end the life of anyone who got near. He then ran from the scene and disappeared into the countryside before the emergency services arrived. The whole incident happened in around 10 minutes. When ambulances did get to the victims, both Wang Xiaojun and his father Wang Zixin were already dead, but Wang Zhengjun had miraculously survived the attack. He would later die in hospital with doctors unable to do anything to save his life. In the immediate aftermath, people went to find Zhang Furu, who was still at his wife's grave, and the village chief, Wang Xiaoming, to tell them what had happened. Neither man needed to be told the details. They both remembered all too vividly the incident that happened 22 years prior. After running away, Zhang Kou Kou hid in the surrounding countryside while heavily armed police searched for him. At one point he attempted to return home to see his father, but hearing voices of police officers coming out of the house, he realized it wasn't safe for him. He disappeared back into the countryside, disposing of the knife in a canal. He tried to find a place to shelter out of the bitter winter cold, at one point heading to a nearby town to get to an ATM. But on seeing there were already wanted posters with his face on, he decided there was no point in trying to hide out anymore. On the 17th of February he handed himself into the police. He confessed all and made his motive of revenge very clear. Showing no remorse, he said his only regret was that he hadn't been able to end the life of the middle Wang family brother. Once news of a man avenging the death of his mother spread, it became a huge story in the national news, and on social media, even more so when it emerged that the person responsible once served in the military. Journalists, influencers, and people claiming to be lawyers descended on the village hungry to know more about what happened and the circumstances from the past that caused it. The events of what happened in 1996, something that was barely known outside of the area before, were going to be gone over in detail. Police also needed to get to the bottom of what caused the actions of Zhang Kou Kou, as it would impact his sentencing. However, getting to the truth of the matter would prove difficult, as members of the two families at the heart of the incident had different recollections of a family feud that spilled over into violence. Things hadn't always been so bad between the two families. Their homes were next to each other in the village and they once had a close relationship. Farmer Wang Zixin, his wife Yang Guiying, and their three sons, Wang Xiaojun, the eldest, Wang Fujun, and the youngest Wang Zhengjun, made up the Wang family. The Zhang family was made up of Zhang Furu, his wife Wang Xiuping, and their two children, daughter Zhang Libo and her younger brother Zhang Kou Kou. The two families were in fact so close the two patriarchs considered themselves godbrothers. A quick aside for clarification, even though the family name of Wang Xiuping sounds similar to the Wang family, her name used a different character, and there was no familial relationship. What actually caused the issues between the two families was never entirely clear, as there are different stories dependent on who was talking. A cousin of the Wang family claimed that at one time Wang Zixin and Zhang Furu did business together, raising and butchering pigs, and a dispute arose over the share of the money. Zhang Furu himself at one point claimed he couldn't remember what happened, but he thought it was over a dispute about watermelons. He recalled that the Wang family were growing the fruit and selling them. However, the plot encroached on his land, so he felt he was due a share of the profit, but his neighbors refused. In a later interview after his son's actions, his story changed. He claimed that the falling out between the two families was over a contract to run what was generously called a rice processing factory, which in reality was a small home with 2 grain processing machines. Both families wanted the contract to run the operation, so they came to an agreement. The Wang family would run the plant for 1 year, then pass on the management to the Zhang family. When it came time to change over, the Wang family reneged on their agreement. Whatever the reason, the neighboring families' relationship was forever changed, and events that followed ensured that the bridge between them would never be rebuilt. The person most vocal in the conflict between the two families, according to villagers, was the mother of Zhang Kou Kou, Wang Xiuping. The 1996 incident became a vital aspect of the case against her son, who was now charged with the brutal homicide of 3 members of the Wang family. People in the village, including surviving members of the Wang family, when speaking to the media, seemed to have a universal opinion of Wang Xiuping. While she was described as a warm-hearted person who played an active part in the community, she was also said to be a woman with a short fuse and wasn't shy about scolding people she had issues with. One villager said if there were 10 people in the village, she would find a reason to quarrel with 8 of them. If she saw someone she had a problem with, she'd start verbally abusing them in the street, then follow them home to continue the abuse. On more than one occasion, she'd taken a quilt to the home of people she'd had an issue with, and lay on the ground outside their front door claiming she'd been physically assaulted by those people. Even members of her own family and her husband's family recalled times when she feuded with them. In the June of 1996, children of both the Wang and Zhang families remembered that Wang Xiuping and the matriarch of the Wang family had a blazing argument in the street, but few could remember what it was about. Just 2 months later, Wang Xiuping would be dead. The exact details of what happened on that day are unclear. Both families had different recollections as to what led to the physical confrontation and what happened during it. What isn't in doubt is that insults being exchanged led to Wang Xiuping being struck in the head and dying of injuries caused by blunt force trauma. Members of both families would give their accounts of that day to the media. The Zhang family statements made to the police went as follows. Wang Xiuping was taking her 2 children to a nearby canal and passed the Wang family home. The middle child, Wang Fujun, who was 20 years old at the time, was sitting outside. As she passed, Wang Xiuping unintentionally coughed up some spittle which hit the ground near Wang Fujun. In response, Wang Fujun slapped the woman in the face, which caused a verbal confrontation. Zhang Libo, the daughter of Wang Xiuping, claimed that other members of the Wang family, the youngest child Wang Zhengjun and the father Wang Zixin, came out of the home and started attacking her mother, pulling her hair and grabbing her by the throat. The teen Zhang Kou Kou ran to get his father, who was feeding his pigs at the time. Arriving at the scene, Zhang Furu tried to pull his wife away when the youngest son of the Wang family, Wang Zhengjun, smashed his wife in the temple with a stick. All the while other members of the Wang family were screaming, "Beat her to death." The statements given by members of the Wang family told a different story. While the beginning remained consistent, Wang Fujun, agreeing that Wang Xiuping and her 2 children walked past him as he sat outside his home. But he claimed she spat in his direction deliberately and kept walking to the local canal. 10 minutes later, while he was still outside, they came back. He claimed Wang Xiuping spat directly into his face. He hurled verbal insults at her and slapped her. There was a brief scuffle, both shouting insults at each other before Wang Xiuping went to her own home with the children. Hearing the shouting, other members of the Wang family came out to see what was happening. Only moments later, Wang Xiuping returned with the children and her husband, an iron bar in her hand. She swung the bar, hitting the youngest of the Wang brothers, Wang Zhengjun, who was 17 at the time, causing a laceration to the young man's head. Furious, Wang Zhengjun picked up a stick from a pile of firewood and struck Wang Xiuping in the head, hitting her in the right temple. The blow caused a cut to her head and she quickly became unsteady on her feet, falling to the ground several times as she tried to walk away. It is impossible to know which of the 2 sides is telling the full truth of the story. There were no witnesses outside of the 2 families who were there for the whole confrontation, but a handful did see Wang Zhengjun strike Wang Xiuping with the wooden stick, and some did report the father Wang Zixin cheering his son on, telling him to beat her to death. In the aftermath, her family tried to help Wang Xiuping off the ground, but she was unable to stand. She began vomiting, as well as bleeding from the nose and mouth. Rather than take her to a hospital immediately, her husband Zhang Furu instead went to see the head of the village committee, who was responsible for handling disputes between villagers, to complain about the assault, and demanded that the Wang family paid them compensation. Head of the village committee, Wang Xiaoming, who shared the same family name as the Wang family but wasn't related, told him he should get his wife to a hospital first, and then the incident would be investigated. Zhang Furu replied that he wanted the guilty party punished now. When Wang Xiaoming arrived at the scene and saw the condition of Wang Xiuping, he immediately organized her transport to a hospital, and that Wang Zhengjun go to the village doctor. Around 10 o'clock in the evening, 3 hours after the confrontation took place, the head of the village committee received news that Wang Xiuping had died in hospital. Her death due to injuries sustained in the confrontation. He reported the incident to the police, who arrested Wang Zixin and the 2 sons involved. The teen Wang Zhengjun was detained by police, while his father and brother were released. He confessed to causing the injury that led to the death of Wang Xiuping, and was held in detention. 3 days later, back in the village, something was about to happen that was unthinkable to people even then. It was a spectacle that those who saw it would never forget, especially the 13-year-old Zhang Kou Kou. The Zhang family were informed that since Wang Zhengjun was under 18, he was still a minor and couldn't receive the type of punishment an adult would be given. This enraged Zhang Furu and the family of the deceased Wang Xiuping. Zhang Furu was demanding to receive compensation for his wife's death, and that Wang Zhengjun be shot as punishment. The village committee tried to calm the situation. They spent thousands on a coffin for the burial. However, when the body was returned to the Zhang family, they left it on a cart outside the Wang family home, and said they wouldn't bury it until an autopsy was performed. The body had already been left in the streets for 2 days. To try and get the family to be reasonable, and without suitable facilities nearby, the inexplicable and horrifying decision was made to perform the autopsy on the cart in the street. The people who came out to see could barely stomach a few minutes as they watched the medical examiner remove the top of the skull. But the young Zhang Kou Kou stood near the doctor, watching the entire process. No one from his family tried to shield him from the horror he was witnessing. Even after this, the families were still not prepared to bury the body. When the coffin was delivered, they left Wang Xiuping on top of the coffin lid. They began to demand they be allowed to bury the body on the grounds of the Wang family home. During this time, the Wang family had left the area to stay with relatives. Head of the village committee Wang Xiaoming spoke with the families of Wang Xiuping, trying to get them to be more reasonable, and telling them the village committee would cover all funeral costs, but they needed to lay Wang Xiuping to rest. Eventually, Wang Xiaoming got them to see sense, and the funeral went ahead 7 days after the body had been returned to the Zhang family. When the case went to trial, Wang Zhengjun was charged with and found guilty of intentionally causing injury resulting in death. The final criminal judgment seemed to confirm that he was indeed struck first. He was sentenced to 7 years in prison, half of that to be served in a juvenile detention center. Zhang Furu demanded 250,000 RMB compensation, but was told with the financial difficulties the Wang family was facing that was an impossible amount. He would be awarded just over 9,500 RMB, while much less than he wanted for the time. It was still an extremely significant amount of money. Sat in the court throughout the entire proceedings was the 13-year-old Zhang Kou Kou. A young boy who had watched his mother be smashed in the head, sat holding her as she gurgled blood from her mouth, and witnessed her autopsy. These 3 moments, understandably, would be deeply imprinted onto his mind. After the conviction of Wang Zhengjun, life in the village went on as normally as it could. The 2 older brothers of the Wang family would leave the village for other towns or cities in the province. Schoolmates of Zhang Kou Kou at the time didn't notice any huge changes in his personality, except for that he was a little quieter. One childhood friend admitted that the young boy sometimes spoke of getting revenge, but at that age they didn't take it seriously. In 2001, Zhang Kou Kou was conscripted into the military along with 4 other boys from the same area, including the son of the village committee chief. The 2 didn't know each other well, and during their time in the military were placed into different companies. In many reports of the case, it was claimed that Zhang Kou Kou received special forces training, which made for a good story, but in reality he was placed into an artillery regiment. The son of the village chief remembered vividly after basic training, a meeting was held to place the recruits into veteran companies. They were asked why they wanted to be soldiers. When picked out to answer, Zhang Kou Kou said to exercise his body and to avenge his mother. After only 2 years of service, he was demobilized and returned to the village. The military would usually help recruits organize some form of employment for their return to civilian life, but he didn't take the necessary steps to do so. Without work, he only stayed in the village for a short time before heading, as many people from rural areas did, to Guangdong province in the south of China, where there were no shortage of jobs available. Whilst he stayed in his hometown, Zhang Kou Kou never came across the 3 sons of the Wang family. As far as anyone knew, Wang Zhengjun was still in prison, and his 2 older brothers had both left the village to get on with their own lives, and didn't return often. In Guangdong, he would largely work in the city of Shenzhen. Bordering Hong Kong, the city had been little more than a fishing village just 30 years prior, but was developing into one of China's most important cities. However, like most other migrant workers from the countryside, he was only able to find low-paying factory production line jobs, or work as a security guard. People who knew him at the time would describe him as a person with a cheerful, friendly personality with few vices. Unlike his friends, he didn't smoke, drink, or gamble, and was someone who kept himself in good shape. During his time in Shenzhen, he got into a romantic relationship with a woman a few years older than him, who was divorced. They remained together for a few years until the topic of marriage came up. When she asked him about the possibility, he responded by telling her he didn't think he would ever be able to marry, and that he still had an important mission to complete. He would occasionally return home to see his father, who was now living alone, as his sister had moved away to start her own family, but his visits usually didn't last long. As Shenzhen continued to grow and develop rapidly, the cost of living in the city grew along with it. Working jobs that paid as close to minimum wage as possible, Zhang Kou Kou found it increasingly difficult to save money. He began moving around various provinces in the country to improve his lot. He found work from people he'd served in the military with, but found himself being scammed a number of times, either by people running pyramid schemes or fake training courses. On one occasion, with one friend from his regiment, he joined a course to learn to operate excavators. They paid a few thousand RMB to go through the training. Once they did this successfully, they were told to go to the local police station in their hometowns to receive their licenses. At the police station, they were informed they'd been scammed. In the hopes of earning more money, Zhang Kou Kou made the decision to work overseas. There are two claims made about where exactly he traveled to. His lawyer claimed it was Fiji. This was contradicted by a childhood friend, who claimed it was Argentina, and the two often had conversations about his experience there. In the July of 2017, Zhang Kou Kou returned to his family home, and this time didn't leave. In his time away, his father, a carpenter by trade, had done a lot of work renovating the home. He'd added another floor where his son now had a new living space to himself. He told his father he planned to stay until the Spring Festival, and then would leave to look for work. Once the Spring Festival came around, looking out of the window of his newly built room, Zhang Kou Kou saw Wang Zhengjun for the first time since the 1996 trial. While his older brothers only returned to the village occasionally over the years, since being released from prison, Wang Zhengjun hadn't returned until now. He'd been living and working in Xi'an, a city 300 kilometers from his hometown in Hanzhong. After his release from prison, he'd married, had children, but found it hard to build a new life. He often asked his brothers and extended family members for loans, which he didn't pay back. This year, he decided to return home. It was a decision that would prove to be fatal for the now 39-year-old. Watching the Wang family happily enjoying the New Year festivities enraged him. Zhang Kou Kou wasn't prepared to wait any longer. He was going to turn his words about avenging his mother into actions. In the days leading up to his spree, he handed his father 40,000 RMB, all the money he'd managed to save over the years. He then waited for his opportunity to finally complete his mission. It would take him less than 10 minutes to do something he'd been waiting over 20 years to get done. After his arrest and confession, Zhang Kou Kou was taken back to the village, under heavy police escort, to the scenes of his attacks to talk police through what he did. Just as people had in 1996 with his mother's autopsy, villagers came out to watch as he walked police through his assaults on the Wang family. Among the onlookers was his father, who hadn't seen him since leaving to go to the grave of Wang Xiuping that morning. His son spotted him in the crowd of onlookers, and told him everything was okay. On the 19th of February, Zhang Kou Kou was formally charged with the intentional homicide of Wang Zhengjun, Wang Xiaojun, and Wang Zixin. While it is common in China in cases where there is a clear confession of guilt, to hold trials soon after the arrest, because of the motives and background to the crime, this time there was a delay as an investigation took place. If found guilty, Zhang Kou Kou would be facing the death penalty, unless the court felt there were extenuating circumstances that explained his actions. The version of events Wang Fujun told remained consistent with the statements he gave in 1996. He even had to defend his family against rumors about them having influence over the court's judgment handed to his younger brother.
就是汪秀萍的男的是张福如和他女儿从家里过来，手里拿了一根扁铁，他的女儿把扁铁交给他母亲，然后朝兄弟头上打了一下，然后左脸上。
People in the village believed that Wang Xiaojun, who wasn't there the day his brother hit Wang Xiuping, was the head of the local government of another town, so had used his power to influence the court's decision. However, according to Wang Fujun, his brother was only 24 at the time, and had only just started working at the town government, holding a low position with a salary of 300 RMB per month. He had little power or influence to do anything at that time. The Zhang family, and many others in the village, felt that the 7-year sentence given to Wang Zhengjun at the time was too lenient, despite the fact he was considered a minor. There was even a belief that he had secretly been released early thanks to the position of his eldest brother Wang Xiaojun, who would later be one of the victims. Wang Fujun admitted that his youngest brother was released after serving only 4 years, and remained on an equivalent of probation for the remaining 3 years of his sentence. But it was not because of his family.
最后我们走到跟前嘛，比如说我要从跟前过，你站在那，你嘴里开始骂的骂我，你一个小伙子骂一个女人，女人肯定要还口，你要不骂他能还口吧？最后他能骂我，最后我骂他，他看我们骂他急了，他抓住骂他的货，换了话。
The story told by Zhang Libo, the sister of Zhang Kou Kou, also remained consistent, although she did claim her family never received the compensation awarded to them by the court or an apology from the Wang family.
只给了1500，但是这是事实，就1500，从那之后了结了，没了，啥事都没了。
On the other hand, the story told by Zhang Furu would have a dramatic change. In a TV interview he claimed that the person that struck his wife wasn't the 17-year-old Wang Zhengjun, but was the middle brother Wang Fujun, who was over 18. He claimed the Wang family got the younger brother to say it was him because he was a minor and would receive a lesser punishment.
这孩子，他给老二拿着一根棍子从后面咵压到头上了。
当时在哪儿打的？拿棍子？大概就是这个位置。
大概就是这个位置，都是这个。
当时您看到的是老二打？
哎，老二打的。
老二打完之后呢？
When the new accusation was put to Wang Fujun, he rubbished it, saying that Zhang Furu was only making the claim to try and save his son from the death penalty. On January 8, 2019, Zhang Kou Kou eventually faced trial for the intentional homicide of the 3 members of the Wang family. The trial was live-streamed around the country at the request of the defendant. He threatened to remain silent throughout the proceedings if it wasn't broadcast, and he wanted the public to hear what he had to say. There was a huge amount of interest in the case, with Zhang Kou Kou receiving a significant amount of support for his actions. There was no doubt about his guilt, but the severity of his punishment was in question. His defense lawyer, Deng Xueping, put forward the evidence of his voluntary surrender to police, the fact he confessed, and assisted with the investigation as grounds for a lighter punishment, but most focus was put on the events of the past, and how that undoubtedly caused mental trauma to the 13-year-old boy. During his time in detention, Zhang Kou Kou underwent an electrocardiogram examination that showed up abnormalities, which the lawyer argued was evidence of his client suffering some form of PTSD. Furthermore, Zhang Kou Kou had no criminal record prior to his attack on the Wang family. He argued that while his client's actions were intentional, in this case the death penalty was unjustified. The prosecution countered the claims. They pointed to the accused only handing himself in because he didn't have money to help him get away, something Zhang Kou Kou admitted to police in his confession. Also that in the same confession he misled investigators about the location he disposed of the knife used in the attack. They also argued that the premeditation shown, and the controlled manner with which he carried out the crimes, demonstrated that he was mentally sound at the time. It was further argued that claiming he was entirely motivated by avenging the death of his mother was an excuse to justify his actions. The prosecution believed that he was dissatisfied with his own life, having financial struggles, not being able to start a family, and a distrust of people were what caused him to vent his anger and frustrations that day. They cited the length of time between the 2 incidents, and the fact that one of his victims, the eldest brother Wang Xiaojun, wasn't present at the assault on his mother. Again looking to his confession, Zhang Kou Kou stated that in the days leading up to the crime, he watched the Wang family from his window and noticed one brother had a new car and they seemed to him to be doing better in life than he was, and felt that was unjust. The claim he was only using his mother's death to justify his actions angered Zhang Kou Kou. When given the opportunity to speak and defend himself, he spoke passionately and firmly when refuting some of the claims by the prosecution. Videos of his speech would go viral on social media platforms, quickly growing into the most viewed clips on TikTok.
把他们当朋友，掏心掏肺给他们，他们跟我套近乎嘛，我掏心掏肺给他们说了之后，我又不知道这怎么回事，最后呢，检察机关就拿这个来起诉我，说我给我妈报仇是幌子，我是对这个社会不满，对生活不满，我把人家杀了。对这个社会对生活不满的人多了，那每个人都去把人杀了吗？每个人杀人都有自己的理由，对不对？我又不是个神经病。
He agreed with the court that he was indeed dissatisfied with his own life, but added that it is a normal part of living, with many people feeling the same way, but not everyone does what he did. He told the court that in the 20 years since his mother's death, the Wang family had shown his family nothing but contempt, never apologizing for what happened. He added that the reason for the gap between his mother's death and his taking revenge was simply down to timing. It was the first time he'd seen Wang Zhengjun together with the family. He wanted to allow Wang Fujun time to join them, but felt if he waited he'd miss his opportunity.
上诉人张扣扣，
到，
庭前是否已经核对了你的身份？
是的，
你的身份与汉中中院一审判决认定的身份是否一致？
一致。
你什么时间收到汉中市中级法院一审刑事判决书
1月12。
？1月12号。
是。
汉中市中级人民法院2018陕零七刑处37号刑事判决书认定你犯什么罪，给你判处什么刑罚？
犯故意杀人罪和毁坏财产罪，判处死刑。
具体是杀人罪判处死刑，剥权终身；故意毁坏财物罪判处有期徒刑4年，合并执行死刑，剥夺政治权利终身。
是。
你是否在法定期限内提出上诉？
是的。
At the end of the trial, Zhang Kou Kou was sentenced to death. When asked by the judge if he intended to appeal, he replied with a firm yes. After his appearance in court and the viral videos, public opinion turned even more to his favor. While most understood he needed to be punished, a significant proportion of people felt the death penalty was far too harsh for his crime. Online discussion forums and social media posts would frequently portray him as a heroic or even romantic figure, especially on TikTok. After the verdict was handed down, Zhang Furu petitioned the provincial government to reinvestigate the death of his wife. His hope was that if new evidence came to light, then it may help his son's case. In the original verdict, Wang Xiuping, based on the witness testimony at the time, was held partly responsible for the outcome. With no possibility of new, neutral witnesses or evidence coming to light, there was little reason to go over old ground again, and the petition was rejected. Zhang Furu didn't help matters by now claiming that Wang Fujun was the person who struck his wife after years of firmly stating it was Wang Zhengjun. It was viewed as an attempt to in some way finish what his son had started and get the final brother punished. It also brought into question his version of the incident in 1996, making his testimony seem unreliable. Despite this, such was the support for his son, one individual gave Zhang Furu 10,000 RMB so he could pay for a psychological evaluation to support his son's appeal. It was to see if Zhang Kou Kou was suffering from PTSD, as the electrocardiogram suggested. However, any evidence it provided couldn't be used in court, as there was no real way to prove if the condition was present before the attack on the Wang family, or manifested after. On the 11th of April 2019, the appeal hearing took place. With no new evidence for the defense team to put to the court, the original verdict was upheld, and the death sentence stood.
对社会造成的不良影响，我表示道歉，希望得到大家的谅解吧。对被害人吧、家属吧，怎么说呢，表示歉意，希望他们能够谅解我吧。
Before being taken away, he apologized for his actions and the effect they had, and hoped for forgiveness. But he stopped short of apologizing fully to the victims' families. 3 months later, on the 17th of July, the sentence was carried out, and Zhang Kou Kou was executed. The reaction by his supporters to the final verdict was one of anger, feeling the death penalty was unjust. There was a lot of criticism aimed at his lawyer, whom many felt performed poorly in the defense of his client, claiming he only took the case on to raise his public profile. 3 years later, controversy around the judgment reignited, when the judge who handed down the original verdict in the first trial was arrested for embezzlement and bribery. Cao Jianguo was found to have accepted bribes and given favorable sentences to friends and relatives. He was arrested in 2022 and later imprisoned. Although there was no suggestion of anything being wrong in the case of Zhang Kou Kou, it didn't stop conspiracy theories about corruption circulating online. Shortly after the execution was carried out, journalist Liu Xiangnan, who had produced possibly the most comprehensive coverage of the case with a 15,000-word article on it from beginning to end, and extensively interviewed people involved, contacted Wang Fujun to ask how he felt about the execution. Wang Fujun replied that he couldn't feel happy about it. There were no winners in the situation, and it had only left him with feelings of sorrow. The last remaining relative living in the village, his mother Yang Guiying, would soon move out, and the Wang family home would be left empty. Zhang Furu continues to reside in the village, now alone. his daughter lives in another city raising her own family. The extension he built, and hoped would one day be occupied by his son's family, lies empty. Even as recently as 2023, he was being visited by people who wanted to show their support for him. The influencers made sure to record the meetings, and post the videos onto TikTok. Being interviewed after the death of his son Zhang Kou, told reporters he wasn't going to collect the ashes, as he felt the end verdict was unjust, so they could keep him. He continued to claim Wang Fujun was the true guilty party in the death of his wife, and went on to say that the Wang family prevented his son from marrying by bad-mouthing him to proposed matches over the years. There are still many articles and videos produced about the case, with most portraying Zhang Kou Kou as an avenging hero. Taking revenge for the death of loved ones is a common trope in much of Chinese literature, and has seen him compared with heroes of the past. The boy who joined the army to take revenge for his mother's death is a story that could have come straight out of the tales of the War of the Three Kingdoms. And while there are many who view Zhang Kou Kou as a romantic hero, there are others who agree with the court's decision. As people discussed whether the death penalty was justified or too harsh, often lost in the discourse was the collateral damage left behind. With the Zhang family often being cast as the good guys, the Wang family are frequently portrayed as the villains. Many articles written about the case would make it seem that Wang Xiuping was viciously beaten to death, with the Wang family's version of events ignored. The matriarch of the Wang family, Yang Guiying, was made a widow at 68 years of age. She and Zhang Kou Kou briefly came face to face after he ended her husband's life. As they stood opposite each other, he told her he was only sparing her because she was a woman. That day she lost her husband, and both her first and last-born sons. She'd eventually leave the village which had been her home for the majority of her life, leaving behind lifelong friends in the process. Both Wang Zhengjun and Wang Xiaojun had children of their own, some studying in college at the time of their deaths. The surviving brother, Wang Fujun, now tries to take care of his mother, his own children, and deal with debts left behind by his youngest brother. He also had to cope with becoming a target of abuse from people online, including receiving regular death threats. In one interview he talked about how much his mother misses her home and wants to return, but he is too afraid to allow that, fearing that the cycle of violence that had occurred between the two families will just continue. Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed the video, please consider giving it a like, leaving a comment, and subscribing to the channel. And hope to see you again for the next dark tale from the Middle Kingdom.